Warning. Content contains descriptions of sexual violence and sexism. Viewer discretion is advised. Hello, darlings. It's your favorite degenerate effeminate finally here with a new video. I hope you haven't missed me too much, but sadly, life and laziness has a way of distracting even the best of us. Anywho, on to the topic of today's video. Based on the results of the poll, today we're going to be covering a rather wide topic, Third World Feminism, and its often heated relationship with feminists in the First World. But first, prima parte, the Third World. You may have heard the term Third World before. What the hell does it actually mean? Well, it actually comes from everyone's favorite decade, the 1950s. At the time, the US and the USSR were involved in the Cold War. The United States and its allies in Western Europe, Oceania, and Japan were grouped into the First World. These countries were characterized by their high standard of living, their somewhat democratic governments, and their colonialist and imperialist pasts. Meanwhile, the USSR and its puppets, friendly, not at all coerced allies in Eastern Europe, were known as the Second World. Their governments were Marxist-Leninist in ideology, but very authoritarian, good people's democracies? These nations had industrialized, but the quality of life there was much lower than in the first. Finally, we come to the rest of the world. Many of these countries were bribed or forced to follow one ideology or the other. However, most of them ended up joining the non-aligned movement, a pact of neutrality formed in the early Cold War. These countries were mostly former colonies and were characterized by their pre-industrial economies and their low standards of living. Nowadays, the terms are somewhat out of date as, in case you haven't noticed, the Cold War ended about 30 years ago. I'm thinking about a new way of classifying the world's countries, and I might make a video on it at some point. Anyway, although there's been a lot of progress since the 1950s, the Third World is still generally a much poorer place than the first, and also much more socially conservative. So keeping all that in mind, what does this mean for women and girls? Osakaksi, top 5 issues women face in the Third World. Of course, if I tried to summarize all the problems and disadvantages women face in that region of the world, we'd be here forever. With this in mind, I decided to focus on 5 issues that I consider to be particularly pressing in this part of the world, ranked in no particular order. The first problem facing women in the Third World that I want to touch on is that of child marriage. Although it might seem ridiculous and horrifying that anyone would want to marry a little kid, child marriage is still a frightening reality in many parts of the world. Every year, 13.5 million children are married, often to people many decades their seniors. This fate is mostly chosen for girls, who make up 82% of all child spouses. After the marriage, the brides don't have much to look forward to. They become stuck taking care of multiple children, preventing them from ever getting an education. Worst of all, they are much less likely to receive the medical attention they need during pregnancy. That brings us to the second major struggle Third World women face. Every year, over 3,000 women die in childbirth. 99% of these women come from the developing world. It is also, sadly, the leading cause of death for teenage girls living in the Third World. Most of these deaths could be prevented if people in these countries were given the same access to the same medical technology available here. The third thing that Third World women are trying to get is education. Although we often joke about how much we hate school here, people living in the Third World don't have the luxury of an education and the skills that it provides. That's why it's scarcely surprising that over 250 million students are missing school from ages 6 to 17. Most of these children are girls, due to being made to help out at home, fears of an unsafe learning environment, or getting married and being expected to take care of their new husband's house. The result is that almost 500 million women are illiterate, and why women account for almost 2/3 of the world's illiterate adult population. The fourth fight for feminists in the Third World is the issue of land ownership. Despite supplying 60% of the labor needed to produce agricultural foods in Asia and Africa, women in the developing world own only 1/10 of the land. Now that's what my boy Karl Marx would call exploitation. Finally, we come to one of the best known, but also one of the most terrible abuses. I am talking, of course, about FGM. The practice has scarred over 200 million women alive today, and 3 million girls are at risk of undergoing it every year. Now, you hopefully weren't wondering why FGM is so wrong, but just in case you didn't think cutting off a part of another person's body without their consent was bad, here are some other reasons to hate the practice. 1. The operation is very painful and can often cause infection and even death. 2. It makes intercourse much less pleasurable and much more painful for women. 3. It causes infertility and can create lots of problems for women in labor. Now, as bad as life may be for women in the third world, they haven't given up hope, and neither should you. I want to highlight these 5 amazing feminists who have already begun tackling these issues in their own unique and inspirational ways. Partie 3. 5 heroines. The first wonderful woman I want to talk about today is Kakenya Ntaiya. She grew up in southern Kenya and was engaged at the age of 5. When she was 13, she convinced her father to let her stay in school, and in exchange, she would take part in her people's coming-of-age ceremony. He agreed, but little did she know that the ceremony would conclude with an act of FGM carried out upon her. Rising above that traumatic experience, with lots of hard work and the financial support of her tribe, she was able to study in the United States. Later, she used that education to start a non-profit boarding school in her village, where girls could be safe from being raped on the way to school. The school includes sexual education and works to ensure that girls know and are secure from the dangers of FGM, child marriage, and early pregnancy, as well as providing them with the education they'll need to get ahead. The second feminist I want to mention is Angella Musiimenta. As a mother in Uganda, she often struggled with the poor healthcare services provided to her by the Ugandan government. Nevertheless, she persisted and ended up becoming a PhD in health informatics. She has had her work published in numerous peer-reviewed journals, mainly focusing on strategies to tackle the AIDS crisis in Uganda. She also had her suggestions to combat maternal mortality published in New Vision, Uganda's leading daily. She was recently awarded Fogarty's Emerging Global Leader Award, giving her $3 million to pursue her research into tuberculosis medication. The third name on this list is one that I'm sure most of you are very familiar with. Malala Yousafzai grew up in the Swat district of Pakistan. When she was only 11, she began speaking up about the Taliban's repression of girls' right to an education. She was then approached with the dangerous task of writing a blog for the BBC while her district was occupied by the Taliban. For 3 months, she wrote about the repressive situation in the region, and then spoke up on national TV, which led the Taliban to make some concessions. She continued her activism and rose to international prominence when she was nominated for the International Children's Peace Prize by Desmond Tutu. Her growing popularity angered the Taliban, who decided to have her killed. On the 9th of October, 2012, Malala was shot in the head on her school bus. She survived and has continued to fight for children's right to an education to this day. The fourth woman I want to touch on is called Vandana Shiva. She not only has one of the coolest names I've ever heard, but she is also a prominent eco-feminist. She was born in the Indian state of Uttar Pradesh in the 1950s. She studied science and philosophy in both India and Canada before graduating in 1978 with a PhD in the philosophy of physics. She emerged as a critic of agricultural policy in India, complaining that traditional knowledge was being lost in exchange for pollution and a dependence on expensive chemicals. To fight back, she launched 9 Seeds, an organization devoted to collecting multiple seed strands in seed banks to preserve biodiversity and to teaching farmers sustainable agriculture. Lately, Vandana has been a harsh critic of Monsanto and its policy of monoculture and patented seeds. She is also a feminist, seeing similarities in the way women are treated as passive and lesser by the patriarchy, and how nature is treated by greedy corporations and governments. Finally, I want to turn the spotlight to Josephine Kulea. Josephine was born into the Samburu people of Kenya. The Samburu have a custom where once a girl turns 6, any male relative of hers can put a red bead necklace around her neck. Then he can have sex with her after first performing FGM against her, and it is the child's responsibility to make sure that no baby results from the rape. Kulea was saved from this by being sent off to boarding school. After becoming a nurse, she raised funding to save her 3 sisters from the practice, and then later founded the Samburu Girls Foundation, a non-profit which rescues Samburu girls and provides them with secondary education. Using contacts with the wives of of political leaders, a radio program, and a large network of informants, Kulea has been able to save over 1,000 girls from the Samburu beating. You might well think that the above cause is something nobody could possibly object to. Well, TLVR, trash. AKA Germaine Greer. So there's this Australian feminist called Germaine Greer. She already has some rather interesting views on trans women, but being a TERF, you'd at least think she'd be sympathetic to women fighting against FGM. That's where you're wrong, folks. You are giving this lady way too much credit. You see, Germaine, I have a terrible opinion on everything Greer, actually believes that FGM is not really a bad thing, and the attempts to ban it are an attack on cultural identity. The reason she gives for the supposedly vital role that genital mutilation plays in the effective cultures? Its longevity. Greer says it must also be a procedure with considerable cultural value because it survived 50 years of criminalization and concerted propaganda campaigns. Greer must also think the practice of sati, the burning of widows in India, is of even more cultural value, considering that it survived not only the British, but Mughal and also the Indian government's criminalizations. Now, to be absolutely fair to Germaine Greer, she does point out that the practice represents a significant health risk and begrudgingly admits that women trying to stop non-consensual FGM must be supported. However, this only comes after Greer says that Westerners have no right to criticize the practice, as, at the time she published these opinions in 1999, the American Academy of Pediatrics recommended surgery on baby girls with clitorises over 3/8 of an inch long. While I agree with Greer that these sorts of surgeries are wrong, but sadly still common with intersex kids, and the decision should always be left to the individual once an adult, barring medical necessity, this response reeks of tukoku. That's right, I just referenced an argumentative fallacy in a YouTube video. I'm such a pseudo-intellectual. Germaine also attempts to justify the practice by pointing out that FGM is mainly carried out by women. While this is true, it doesn't really make it any better. During the witch trials, it was often women reporting other women, but that didn't make them any more justifiable. This whole bizarre experiment in bad cultural relativism comes to a climax when Greer compares FGM to getting a tattoo. Oh, wait, you thought I was joking, didn't you? Greer says that we should be considering the possibility that FGM acts in a similar way to tattooing and body piercing to assert the individual woman's control over her genitals and to customize them to her specification. This is obviously ridiculous, considering FGM is mostly performed at the hands of an older woman like a grandmother, and there seems to be no proof of any girls going, you know what would be cool? Cutting off my clitoris! So what's the point of dissecting this blistering hot take? Well, I'm starting to notice a trend where all the top feminist YouTubers like Sean, Contra, and H Bomber Guy concentrate pretty much just on feminism as it pertains to the first world. This isn't me trying to call them out or anything, but it is telling how so little content is made educating people about the places where the majority of the world's people live. I'm also not trying to dismiss first world feminism. I do think we have a lot of work to do here. What I'm trying to say is that if we don't do anything to cover this territory, then we cede the public's conception of the third world to the right and to crazies like Germaine Greer. Anyway, that's all for now. To decide the topic for my next video, you can vote on the poll I've set up on my Twitter page. A link will be in the comments section if you want to explore my sources for this video or to make a donation to support any of these heroines. All that good stuff is in the video description. If you're interested in hearing more from me, don't forget to click the red subscribe button and the gray bell. Ta-ta for now!